Hello and welcome to the Northern Myths podcast, where we explore the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Luke DeWolf.
And I'm Dan Larrabee.
Today we're continuing our series on the Kalevala, with Kalevala Runo 4, the Fate of Aino. Today's episode is going to be, it's a pretty sad story, to be honest, and it's also got... The primary character is Aino, who we were introduced to in the previous Kalevala episode, and she is a young maiden now promised to the hero Väinämöinen. And honestly, she's a character that I personally don't relate to as much from my own personal experience, but she's a very sympathetic character, and we're going to hear all of the reasons why she is sad and does not want to get into an arranged marriage with Väinämöinen.
It's funny that you mentioned that it's a sad story, because I absolutely agree. By the end, I was kind of bummed out. I definitely felt for Aino, and I could see why things happened the way they did. It's a tragedy, and you'll see why it's a tragedy. But and I think it's a tragedy in the very real sense that things have happened that aren't in her control, and she has to face it. Just like all of us, we have things in our lives that we can't control, but we have to face and figure out, and it's tragic.
Exactly. And so before we get into that, and hopefully that doesn't put too much of a damper on this for you, but it is going to be an interesting episode. Lots of good symbolism going on, and it's a good read, and really made me think. And I had to put myself into her shoes is, I guess, a good term for that. But I really had to put myself into her thought process and her way of thinking, and to really get a grasp on what this poem is saying. And so hopefully that comes through, and I'm really excited about it, because it definitely is interesting once you get down to it. But it is a sad episode, and one of the more sad stories we've covered, I think.
Absolutely. It's not even more like a bummer episode. Like we've had, I don't know if we've had like really like downer episodes. We probably have. There's been a few that have Ragnarok episodes tend to be pretty downer, like at least until you get to the new world with Balder and things are good again. But no, this one was poignant, I would say.
I agree with that. And so before we dive in, just our usual housekeeping, and with that, just another thing today as well. We're going to be changing our schedule just a little bit here. We've been pretty good about an episode a week for a little over 3 months here, and we've just got a fair bit going on in our personal lives at the moment, and we want to maintain the quality of the show as best as possible, and we definitely need to take that time to prepare for these episodes. And so we are going to be going to one episode every 2 weeks for the foreseeable future. If we get any guests, we'll probably slot them in kind of in the middle, but for now we're going to be doing one episode on the Kalevala, then one episode on the Poetic Edda 2 weeks time from that, and vice versa for the next little bit. We don't know how long that particular schedule is going to last, but just so you're aware, there will be no new episode the week after this. It will be 2 weeks before the next new episode. And beyond that, if you'd like to get a hold of us on social media, we're on Facebook, Twitter at Northern Myths. We're Northern Myths Podcast on Instagram and YouTube, so you can connect with us on all of those platforms. We love hearing from people. We love getting comments, and every time we can kind of have a discussion, it's a chance for us to grow and to learn, so that's always appreciated. So feel free to check out our social media pages and give us a follow. A share is always appreciated. Definitely helps us to grow. If you've been enjoying the show and you think you know someone who would enjoy it as well, definitely appreciate if you spread the word there. And reviews on iTunes also always go a long way, or on any other platform as well, but iTunes in particular really goes a long way to helping to spread the word of the show and helping us grow. Am I missing anything, Dan?
Not right now. I think that's a pretty good summary of all the ways that people can get in touch with us and help out the show.
Fantastic. Oh, actually, that does remind me. We do have a merchandise store now, so we'll have a link at the bottom. It's through Teespring, and we have a list of recommended books on our website as well. And we kind of go into a lot of things that are influential for us, and we include all the books that we cover on the show as well. So if you want to follow along with us, you can pick up a copy of the Kalevala. Any translation is good, but we're reading the one by Kirby. So that's just something to bear in mind. It is available for free as well. Any of the links or the books on our recommended books page and our recommended music page, actually, if you make a purchase from Amazon through any of those links, a little bit goes to support the show. So that's just a way you can help us out. That's through the Amazon affiliate program. So I think that is everything. And with that, we'll just dive right in.
Sounds good. Let's return to the land of heroes.
Let's do it. Kalevala Runo 4, The Fate of Aino. Back to the poem. Lines 1 to 20. Then the little maiden Aino, youthful Joukahainen's sister, went for besoms to the greenwood, sought for bath whisks in the bushes. One she gathered for her father, and a second for her mother, and she gathered yet another for her young and ruddy brother. As she turned her footsteps homeward, pushing through the alder branches, came the aged Väinämöinen, and he saw her in the thicket, finely clad among the herbage, and he spoke the words which follow. Maiden, do not wear for others, but for me alone, O maiden. Round thy neck a beaded necklace, and a cross upon thy bosom. Plait for me thy beauteous tresses, bind thy hair with silken ribbons. What does that mean, Dan?
So if you recall, at the end of the last Runo, Joukahainen had been defeated by Väinämöinen in a magical battle. And to sort of get out of the shame of defeat and the punishment of defeat, he offered up marriage to his sister, Aino. And Väinämöinen was quite happy to accept, because he's not married, and who doesn't want to marry a beautiful young maiden who is, in the prime of her life, and all these, beautiful, wonderful, all these good things. So it seems to me that Väinämöinen is now coming to kind of collect on the debt that Joukahainen incurred, so that he could get away from, or at least, I'm trying to think of the right word, sort of, because he attacked Väinämöinen and then was defeated, and it's kind of his reparations is to offer his sister. And that's a very weird thing for us to think about in this day and age, offering like someone in marriage without their even just offering someone in marriage. I mean, with or without their consent, we just don't do that. People usually figure out who they want to marry themselves, at least in the Western world. In the rest of the world, arranged marriages are still quite common, and it's usually done to combine families for political reasons, or like for the good of the village, that kind of thing. It's only actually very recently that love became the criteria for marriage. Before then, it was all sorts of usually economic and like social reasons that you would marry your children off. So, and I think we're kind of seeing that here, that it's a very different mindset, very different time, and very different thinking about marriage.
Right, and if you remember in the last episode, Aino was not happy with the arrangement, but her family was. Her parents were perfectly happy with the idea that Aino was going to get to be matched with such a great, prestigious figure, which would have certainly been in the consideration. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of the implications of the way of structuring the world around systems like this. But I think for now, it's enough to just sort of recap and say that Väinämöinen is back, and he wants to claim Aino, who, as far as he is concerned, it's his right to do so now because Joukahainen made the offer and her parents consented, even though she didn't. So yeah, that's just kind of where the situation is now. And I think what he's doing here is saying, wear these beautiful things like this jewelry and stuff only for me. It's to show that you are now mine in all the senses of the word, really. Like properly being almost property would be kind of the case here, unfortunate as that is, right?
I think so. And I think too, it's like, you know, if you're going out with your significant other and you say like, oh, you know, wear that shirt that I really like, kind of thing, right? And he's basically saying like, make yourself beautiful for me, not just to be beautiful. And, you know, we think of ourselves like what we wear is kind of an expression of who we are sometimes, that kind of thing. And Väinämöinen is saying like, no, wear it for my delight. Like it's not necessarily about you now. It's about this marriage. And something I would like to point out is because we've seen this before in the Poetic Edda with Skirnismal, where Skirnir says all these terrible things to I think it's Gerda, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And like just awful things. Väinämöinen won't be doing that in this Runo, and he's not really he's not like the villain in this, so which actually makes it a little more tragic. It's just then I'd probably go on to say like the system of it, right? Like, but yeah, you'll see that he's not going to do anything bad. It's just how the system is set up.
Right, and I mean, if you go back to the last few episodes on the Kalevala, you'll see why Väinämöinen is the proper hero, and we will get into that a lot more. The ordering of the poems in Kalevala is really interesting. It sets things up in an interesting way, and we are going to see a lot more of the heroic stories of Väinämöinen later. So it may not be completely clear why exactly he's such a big deal. Although I would say Runo 2 really showcases his role in the creation of the world and things like that. And not the cosmic creation of the world, the more like the ordering of the world after it's being created sort of thing, which is a variation on that anyway. But he is a heroic character, and he is the protagonist of the Kalevala in most senses. But in this poem, it's from Aino's perspective, and she does not want a marriage that she has not consented to, whether or not it's with the hero of the Kalevala or not. And well, we'll get into why. Shall we move on? And
I think so.
Her response here, yeah. Okay. Lines 21 to 38. Back to the poem. But the young maid gave him answer, not for thee, and not for others, rests the cross upon my bosom, and my hair is bound with ribbons. Not I care for sea-born raiment. Wheaten bread I do not value. I will walk in homespun garments, and with crusts will still my hunger, in my dearest father's dwelling, and beside my much-loved mother. From her breast she took the crosslet, drew the rings from off her fingers, from her neck the beaded necklace, from her head the scarlet ribbons. Down upon the ground she threw them, scattered them among the bushes. Then she hastened, ever weeping, loud lamenting, to the homestead. I keep confusing beaded for bearded. That's different.
I like it though, like a bearded necklace. I could actually see like it'd be like a necklace with like a big hangy thing. I don't know much about jewelry, but yeah.
Oh well.
So this part I I've seen this type of thing happen with friends of mine and that kind of thing, and we see it today. It's when it usually happens after a breakup, and you see, men and women, they'll change something about themselves to like distance themselves from the relationship and the situation. So like a woman might get her hair cut almost drastically. Like my friends always joked about calling it therapy, where they would like. I remember one time a friend of mine had broken up with her boyfriend, and we were going out, and I hadn't seen her in a while, but her hair was drastically different. And I went up to her, I was like, "You're single now, aren't you?" and she'd like, "Yeah, how could you tell?" I'm like, "Your hair, like, it looks good." And it did look good, but it was a lot different from what it had been. And I was like, okay. And then I've also seen guys grow beards or shave their beards. It's a very common thing to sort of, in one way, kind of symbolically remove yourself from the situation or become unattractive to the person that you were with. So when she starts throwing off all of the things that Väinämöinen found attractive, the cross and her hair and all that, and she's changing it all, it's to make herself unattractive and unavailable to Väinämöinen, because she doesn't want to be with him, and she says she doesn't want to be with anyone. She wants to remain at home, and that, she doesn't care about fine clothing. She'll wear homespun garments, and instead of eating like wonderful bread and delicious food that he would provide, she's like, no, crust will keep me full, and they will, but it's just very basic. There's no glamour to it, but she's willing to give all of that up to be able to maintain her freedom.
Yeah, and I like that you pointed out she doesn't want to be with anyone. I think that's a key here. She's essentially taking herself out of the female dominance hierarchy, which, not to really comment on exactly how that would have came about, but really the way the female dominance hierarchy looks to me is women competing with each other for the attention of mates, essentially, and by putting on all these things and all that, like, it's certainly for them, but it's also the purpose on a sort of more subconscious level or a conscious level is to be available and attractive for a mate, as well as to compete with other women for that ability and that privilege and everything like that. And so she does not want to participate. She is taking herself out of the equation. She's saying, no, I don't want to wear any of this stuff for anyone else. And yeah, so it's taking herself out of the breeding pool, the mating pool, whatever, if you want to kind of use terms like that. And the thing about this too is that her not wanting to wear these things for others, I think, has a little bit of a nuance of she does not want to be picked. She wants to do the choosing. And that's a nuance here that maybe gets lost in the way that society both is structured and was structured for a very long time, in the sense that I think the entire point of the female dominance hierarchy is to allow for women to have a higher pick of potential mates. And the order of that is important because it's the women doing the picking. It's the women evaluating the potential men who are available there and making a conscious choice. By being picked, by having that decision taken away from her, that takes away that agency, takes away the right for her to make that incredibly important decision about her life, about any possible reproduction, anything like that. And she is essentially, for all intents and purposes, stepping out of the entire process now by saying, I'm going to take all this stuff off. I'm not going to participate because if I have to end up with this person who I have not chosen, well, then it's not worth it for me at all. That's what I see here.
For sure. I hadn't thought of that, but it what you just said sort of put on a few light bulbs for me, because like you're saying, women are the selectors. They choose, but by like fathers marrying off their daughters, they've sort of circumvented the natural biological process and made it easier for men to become the pickers, and it's probably a lot easier, certainly on the ego, for men to be the pickers than to compete with each other for the affections of a woman and be chosen to reproduce. So I hadn't really thought of it like that, but it's interesting that if we're going to go with this idea that this is sort of how men figured out how to get around that so that it wasn't as difficult. And like, while you're talking, I was like, did I just discover the patriarchy?
No, the funny thing about this whole thing, when I say female dominance hierarchy, male dominance hierarchy, it's usually not that like clinical. It's people don't think like that consciously, right? But it's just the way that we would have been organized. I've got a lot more to say about this a bit later because it ties in a little bit better. But long and the short of it really is kind of like this is just how people behave. This is not saying that this is the way it should be or anything like that, but it just is the way that people behave. Like men compete with each other to get higher up the rung and then be more attractive for women, and women are also competing with each other for the right to pick, essentially. And well, again, I'll get into a little bit about why having to compete with each other for the right to pick may be a little bit of a social thing. I'll get into it later because, again, it ties in just a fair bit better when we get further into this, but that's where I'm going with it. I'm definitely not saying that this is what men and women are predetermined to do or act sort of thing, but it has implications on how people, men and women, end up thinking and behaving, especially when they're growing up and they're faced with the decisions of marriage and romance and careers and all that. It's big. It's got a lot of implications to it, which is kind of why I went there here.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that. Should we move on? So dig more into these implications?
Let's do it. And this one is going to be somewhat long and is going to be a little repetitive. This poem does that. It's maybe longer than it necessarily needs to be because it's essentially going to be repeating events and recapping them a little bit. But we'll go through the whole thing because of course that's what we do. But I'm going to be going from lines 39 to 116. Back to the poem. At the window sat her father, while he carved a hatchet handle. Wherefore weepest thou, my daughter, young and yet so full of sadness? Cause enough have I for weeping, cause for weeping and lamenting. Therefore weep I, dearest father, weep and feel so full of sorrow. From my breast I lost the crosslet, from my belt I dropped the buckle, from my breast my silver crosslet, from my waist the copper girdle. At the gate her brother sitting, for the sledge was shaping runners. Wherefore weepest thou, my sister, young and yet so full of sorrow? Cause enough have I for weeping, cause for weeping and lamenting. Therefore do I weep, poor brother, weep and feel so full of sorrow. Rings I lost from off my fingers, from my neck my beaded necklace, and my finger rings were golden, and my necklace beads were silver. At the window sat her sister, as she wove a golden girdle. Wherefore weepest thou, poor sister, young and yet so full of sorrow? Cause enough have I for weeping, cause for weeping and lamenting. Therefore do I weep, poor sister, weep and feel so full of sorrow. From my brow the gold has fallen, From my hair I lost the silver, tore the blue bands from my temples, from my head the scarlet braiding. On the threshold of the storehouse, skimming milk, she found her mother. Wherefore weepest thou, my daughter, young and yet so full of sorrow? O my mother, who hast borne me, O my mother, who hast nursed me, cause enough have I for anguish, cause enough for bitter sorrow. Therefore do I weep, poor mother, therefore grieve I, O my mother. To the wood I went for besoms, gathered bath whisks from the bushes. One I gathered for my father, one I gathered for my mother, and I gathered yet another for my young and ruddy brother. As I turned my footsteps homeward, and across the heath was tripping, from the dell there came Osmoinen, from the field cried Kalevala. Do not wear, fair maid, for others, but for me alone, poor maiden, round thy neck a beaded necklace, and a cross upon thy bosom. Plait for me thy beauteous tresses, braid thy hair with silken ribbons. From my breast I took the crosslet, from my neck the beaded necklace, tore the blue bands from my temples, from my head the scarlet ribbons. Then upon the ground I threw them, scattered them among the bushes, and I answered him in this wise: Not for thee, and not for others, rests my cross upon my bosom, and my hair is bound with ribbons. Naught I care for sea-born raiment. Wheaten bread I do not value. I will walk in homespun garments, and with crusts will still my hunger, in my dearest father's dwelling, and beside my much-loved mother.
Well, the first thing I'll talk about is the repetition. I can really hear the song in it, and I can picture and hear people singing this, and that being the reasoning for the repetition. Like it really lends itself to that kind of poetry and singing. So I find that very interesting. I mean, there's even more repetition as we go on, but as I was reading it, I was really thinking like, oh, I can really grasp how this is how it's meant to be performed and shared in a group. So she goes around to her family and is weeping and sort of explaining what just happened. And I think it's interesting the focus on the things that she took off. We talked a little bit about the idea of changing the appearance so you're not as attractive for the other person. But I think another way to look at it too is that these are things that sort of have come from her family, and they're signs of being well put together and sort of well ordered, at least in the familial sense. Like, you know, you've got your hair in the ribbons, and you know, you've got your cross and your girdle, and you're well put together. And to me, it's kind of like that's the least amount of, I guess, oppression from, because, you know, the family unit is oppressive, as in that you are not ultimately free or completely free. You don't get to choose your family and all that kind of stuff. You don't get to choose who your mother and father are, and they usually set rules for you so that you can survive and thrive. And in doing so, in taking part in that order, you do get a few things. So, you know, she's talking about what I would assume is kind of a beautiful outfit, like a well put together outfit. She looks good, and she's sort of willing to throw off the benefits of that if it means she doesn't have to participate in the bigger game. And that's sort of what a family is. It's sort of the training ground so that you can participate in society. And I think we can all agree that society is oppressive by its very nature. That's the kind of the point of it, which doesn't mean it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just that if you want to participate in society, you agree to a certain amount of oppression so that everyone can kind of get along with each other without worrying about, dying or stealing or, antisocial behavior. I mean, it's sort of right in the name. It's antisocial behavior. So she's obviously really reeling from the idea of having to marry Väinämöinen, who I think is in this case is the symbol of society and the oppression that comes with that. And she's saying, like, I am willing to forego even the benefits that come from, certainly from society, but also like even the benefits that come from my family. Like, as long as I get the bare minimum with my family, like, I'm happy with that. If I don't have to go off into society.
Right. She's certainly pushing back on expectations of her, which, is kind of understandable, honestly. It's hard to have any perspective as a teenager, which I broadly assume that Aino is teenage years here, because, marriages happened a lot younger back in the day, and certainly it would have been whenever a girl would reach puberty. Essentially, that would mean she was eligible for marriage at that time. I don't know what an average would be, but I would think 14 to 16 would have been like fairly common, right? Something like that. And that's tough. That's a really hard period of time to have to go through this stuff, especially when it's something arranged, and that really does turn into family expectations. And today, I don't know how much we can relate to specifically that circumstance. And this is not to say that only girls kind of had this burden necessarily. Like, guys had a lot of family expectations, and in fact they would have had the expectations of continuing on the family business and things like that too. It's not equal, but it's different. They're different struggles, and here I think the way I can best relate to it is just not having any real sense of what I was going to do with my life when I was in high school, for example, and family expectations, all that. Like, it's not the same, but that's the closest thing. And yeah, here she's just wanting to back out of it. This whole section, I think, just really ratchets up the emotional intensity of this poem. It's the repetition, all of the emphasis here. I think it really just is to show that Aino is having a tough go of it at the moment, and I can absolutely empathize with that, honestly.
Absolutely, it's I think it's an effective way of showing her pain, and like, she is quite young, and there's a part I think coming up where they talk about, where her mother talks about feeding her good food to, I think they say something very close to rounding her out. So I think she is quite young. Like, she's probably like just recently like biologically capable of having a baby or getting pregnant, but probably not that much older than that. So no, it's tough. And yeah, you were right too. Like, men had a different set of challenges, and I think it's safe to say that it kind of then and still does sort of suck for everyone across the board, just in different ways, and to different degrees, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm not trying to equate people's experiences, especially on a group level, but on an individual level, definitely not, because that's everyone has their own experience of life and how that works for them and how that makes sense for them. But I think a fairly common thing, definitely won't say universal, but fairly common, would be that I think everyone has to come to terms with the idea that society and the rules of society and the life they were born into, all of that, you can't really change a whole heck of a lot of that. And the decision actually does, I think, become, do you want to participate in mainstream society or not? And that's a hard choice. And learning how to participate properly is the trick. And Well, it is the trick, but there's no trick to it. It's like sometimes you're compromising, sometimes you're, working a 9-to-5 job you don't absolutely love, but it pays the bills and keeps a roof over your head and all that, right? Like that is the oppression of society. But at the same time, it's also the way that the world has organized itself that broadly keeps most people living fairly prosperously, at least in the West and even throughout the world. It's poverty is decreasing in most of the world at the moment, and that's a good thing. And that does have a lot to do with society just being able to keep order and to keep bringing more and more people up. And it certainly is possible to function outside of the mainstream normal thing, but it's hard. And choosing not to participate in mainstream society and the way society is organized kind of in the mainstream way, it's hard. There are a lot of challenges to living like that. And again, not to really say not to say this again too much, but I want to go at least one or two more sections here before really digging into this, but I can definitely see where Aino is having a tough time.
Definitely. And the only one other thing I'd like to point out before we move on, I love how this was translated. I'm not sure what the Finnish would be, but when she says not for thee and not for others in response to how she's dressing and that kind of thing. I don't know why, but I love that line. It's there's sort of a rebellious, independent nature about it that I really like. And I could see this on a t-shirt and it would be great.
Exactly. And I think if we move on here, we'll get into exactly what
sounds good.
You were just talking about here. So, okay. Lines 117 to 188. Back to the poem. And her mother answered thus wise, said the old crone to the maiden, do not weep, my dearest daughter, do not grieve, and thou so youthful. Eat a whole year long fresh butter, that your form may grow more rounded. Eat thou pork the second season, that your form may grow more charming. And the third year eat thou cream cakes, that you may become more lovely. Seek the storehouse on the mountain, there the finest chamber open. There are coffers piled on coffers, chests in heaps on chests are loaded. Open then the finest coffer, raise the painted lid with clangor. There you'll find 6 golden girdles, 7 blue robes of finest texture, woven by the moon's own daughter, by the sun's own daughter fashioned. In the days when I was youthful, in my youthful days of girlhood, in the wood I sought for berries, gathered raspberries on the mountain, heard the moonlight's daughter weaving and the sunlight's daughter spinning. There beside the wooded island, on the borders of the greenwood. Thereupon I softly neared them, and beside them took my station, and began to ask them gently in the words that I repeat you. Give you of your gold, O Kuutar, and your silver give, Päivätär, to the maiden poorly dowered, to the child who now implores you. Then her gold did Kuutar give me, and her silver gave Päivätär. With the gold I decked my temples, and adorned my head with silver. Homeward like a flower I hastened, joyful to my father's dwelling. These I wore one day, a second, then upon the third day after, took the gold from off my temples, from my head removed the silver, took them to the mountain storehouse. In the chest with care I laid them. There until this day I left them, and since then I have not seen them. On thy brows bind silken ribbons, on thy temples gold adornments, round thy neck a beaded necklace, on thy breast a golden crosslet. Put thou on a shift of linen, of the finest flax that's woven. Lay thou on a robe of woolen. bind it with a silken girdle. Then the finest silken stockings, and of shoes the very finest. And then in plaits thy hair arranging, bind it up with silken ribbons. Slip the gold rings on thy fingers, deck thy wrists with golden bracelets. After this return thou homewards, from thy visit to the storehouse, as the joy of all thy kindred, and of all thy race the fairest, like a floweret by the wayside, like a raspberry on the mountain, far more lovely than aforetime, fairer than in foretime seasons.
So we have, I'd say, like a really lovely bit here where her mother is, I think, working on the assumption that Aino doesn't want to participate in the game because she's scared that, well, she's just entering the game and no one's good at games that they just enter usually. And her mother's saying, no, like don't worry, I've got you here. We can, well, in some ways we can fatten you up, but basically make it more visibly apparent that you are fertile, because it talks about rounding and, you know, hips and bosom, that kind of thing. It's all signs of fertility. And putting her in the finest clothing and giving the finest food and showing that, you know, she is something to be desired and someone who would be, you know, that men would work for to get her attention. So because the mother, and there's a sort of a small line, said the old crone to the maiden. Well, the crone was the maiden at one point. She's been through this and knows that she knows the game. She's played it and is sort of on the other end of it. So she's passing on that knowledge to the maiden to be like, okay, this is how you play the game. And so she's really pulling out all the stops here for Aino and being like, we can get you into the game and it's going to be fine and you're going to be lovely and everything is going to be great. And I mean, I think that in some ways that's what parents are supposed to do too, right? Is prepare you for the game as best they can and help you along so that you can acclimatize to it and succeed in it. And so it just seems it's just such a nice, like, mother-daughter moment, I think, you know?
No, I agree with that. And the thing here, the symbolism is right on for this. The old crone to the maiden, like that is one of the oldest depictions across time of essentially the feminine. It's the idea of the old crone who has all the wisdom, has experienced life, to the maiden, the next generation. Like that is such a universal symbol across mythologies. Like that's right on, right here. And then, you know, just a few little things here, like the idea of the storehouse on the mountain, like that's high up. That's putting the best things on the high place, aiming for the highest good here is what I get from that. And then she actually prays. Aino's mother prays. She prays to Kuutar and Päivätär, which mean essentially the maiden of the moon and the maiden of the day is essentially what that means. It's literally moon and day with a suffix that indicates a feminine character, essentially. So it's very clear that Aino's mother did aim high. She participated in the game to stumbling over my words, to the fullest extent. She participated to the fullest extent possible, and it's implied, I think, that she was matched up with a mate after 3 days, I think, something like that. Didn't take long. And so yeah, it's all to be like, this is how to do it. This is how to win a mate. And the thing about it though is that I think in this case the nuance here that's missing is Aino has already promised away. Like she, first of all, does not really need to do this at all. She's almost saying, you know, when she's throwing all this stuff off, like, well, why do I need to do any of this stuff if I'm already promised away? Like, why, if I'm already promised away to Väinämöinen, do I need to keep doing this stuff. It seems useless, first of all, and then it's also a case of she's not competing for the affections of, you know, the usual handsome young men sort of thing. She's already paired off with Väinämöinen, and so all of this stuff just kind of combines to, first of all, the really nice way that Aino's mother is helping her, instructing her, but at the same time, from Aino's perspective, how this could be seen as feudal to kind of keep doing this stuff, right? And the other thing too is that this all shows that the social structure and social order is perpetuated by both men and women on the younger generations. And it's the funny thing about that is that it's sort of, I won't say it's counterintuitive, because maybe it is it's intuitive to me, but maybe it's intuitive to you, but I think it could be counterintuitive to the idea that the social order, which is these days linked up with the patriarchy, it is perpetuated by both men and women. To show what has worked for them is essentially the way it's being depicted here. This is what worked for Aino's mother, therefore this is what you should do. And it's sort of a case of, I think as a young person, you don't see the benefits of going along with the existing social order. You see maybe all the ways that you think it could be wrong or it could be improved sort of thing. So you don't want to play the game. But then if you go and play the game, often it works out pretty good, you know? So in this case, it's sort of that double, the conflict between these two characters. It's quite something, because I don't think Aino's mother addresses Aino's concerns, which is that she's promised a way. So why would she go and do any of this?
For sure. I get the feeling that Aino's mother is trying to comfort her and say, hey, we can make this really good, but you still have to play the game. And Aino is having none of it. I don't want to play the game. And I think Aino's mother is under the assumption that, well, of course she's going to play the game. She's going to marry Väinämöinen, and that's how this situation is going to end. And yeah, and Aino's kind of talking about a completely different thing, saying, I am not doing any of this. But I still think it's touching. Like, the mother's very much trying to comfort her and to coax her into kind of accepting it willingly. And I think because, like, there are advantages to working in the system and the game. And I mean, Väinämöinen, it's Väinämöinen. He's the top of the dominance hierarchy. Like, he is the thing that at least men are aiming for. That's why Joukahainen went to fight him, was he wanted to be at the top. So you have this literally like the prime example of how to live. And so, you know, Aino's mother's quite excited, like, oh, you get to be with him. And Aino just doesn't care. I guess her freedom is more important than this.
Yeah, and well, I guess one of the whole things here is that it really is important that Aino does not have a choice in this. And this might actually be one of those points where it's like, yeah, obviously, you know, in this day and age, both people have to be on board, right? And that's a good thing. That's a good social innovation, I think. Back here, that would have been the case, like, you know, not a whole lot of the time. But I think it must not have been all the time. That this is sort of speculation here, sort of, but it must not have been all the time that you know a girl or woman was so adamantly against the matching that would have happened. And you know, I think a loving parent, father, mother would have taken into consideration their daughter's wishes, especially in the lower classes of society, right? Where it's kind of like, well, there's a whole bunch of potential mates kind of on a similar level, and you know, maybe it would be a good thing to take her wishes into consideration, sort of thing. But this is different. Now they got a chance to really jump in class by Aino joining with Väinämöinen. And, well, I think that's sort of overriding here in this case. And you know, I can see how that is and would have been very oppressive, and it would have gone on for quite a long time. And these days we don't do that for the most part in the West. It still happens, though. Arranged marriages still certainly happen, but you know, for the most part, we don't do that, and the woman gets an equal pick to the man. Essentially, they both had to agree, sort of thing. So you could almost say that well, we're back to a state where these days that women get the picking again. They do the picking again, because I mean, let's be honest here somewhat, that you know, as a man, it's like I was very much picked by my wife, and it was just so great to have attentions and things like that. And it's you know, it doesn't really go the opposite direction. I think that should be fairly intuitive, I think, because I do not think it goes the other direction where, you know, a man can't go and pick the woman that he wants. If she doesn't reciprocate, she just doesn't reciprocate. That seems to be kind of the way things go, right? Despite romantic comedies having the general trope of the persistent guy is going to get the girl in the end, sort of thing. Change her mind.
For sure. That's a dark road to go down. The persistence, changing the mind, it doesn't happen really.
I don't think so. And it's I think it's a bad thing to tell young men and young women that that's kind of how things go. And to be fair, I don't think that is really as in the that's not as acceptable culturally anymore as it was in, say, the 80s and 90s. So
yeah, definitely. No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, women do the picking, and we see this in a few different things. I mean, I think that's why like rape is so terrible, right? Because you're violating the woman's right to choose her mate, right? And it's a crime against that person, but also like almost like a crime against like nature itself, and that you're not doing what was laid out for this, right? Or what the biological system was, how it was designed. So yeah, you can see it there. And even in just what you're talking about with arranged marriages, like in the West, we do have quite a few examples from like the Middle Ages and medieval times where like stories like Tristan and Isolde, where they fell in love, but she was promised to like the prince or whatever, and so they had to figure that out. I don't think it ends well. Just like Romeo and Juliet, I mean, two warring families, and they're not supposed to be with each other. And then the whole idea of, I think it's called courtly love, where knights would fall in love with a fair maiden who was usually like the wife of the king, and because marriage was, you know, a political, economical, social arrangement rather than one based on love, there was this idea, and this whole, I guess, literal romance built around it, saying, you know, the purest form of love was courtly love, because you could never actually fulfill those feelings. You could never participate in them. It was just, you know, the knight going off and winning battles for his lady's favor, and it might be, you know, see in movies and stuff like The Handkerchief or whatever, but that was it. There was no way they could, I guess, consummate that love in a very real sense. And then the stories where they do, like in the Arthurian legends, I'm trying to remember, I don't know if it was Galahad or Gawain, because I'm thinking of this as you're talking, it came to mind. I didn't prepare this, but one of the knights, or Lancelot even, one of the famous knights that we have from the Arthurian legends, his downfall comes because he crosses that line from courtly love to like actually participating and consummating that love. And unfortunately, she's married to someone else. So there was this whole mythology and mythos built around like love and marriage and them not crossing, and that was sort of, they tried to make that the point of it, like, oh, it's such a pure and godly love, and it's, well, it doesn't work that way really, like, and I think we've realized that.
Yeah, it's the entire thing is, this gets into the entire concept of monogamy, honestly, and I want to get through one or two more sections before like I go all in on this one, because I'm holding it for Aino's reaction here now, and I think that's going to be telling. So shall we?
Let's get into it. Yeah.
Okay. This will be lines 189 to 230. I actually sort of forgot where we were. This was just the mother had only just spoken, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Sorry.
Well, no, there's such big chunks, it can be hard to remember where we stopped.
Yeah. 189 to 230. Back to the poem. Thus the mother urged her counsel. Thus she spoke unto her daughter. But the daughter did not heed her. Heeded not her mother's counsel. From the house she wandered weeping. From the homestead went in sorrow. And she said the words which follow, and expressed herself in this wise. What may be the joyous feelings and the thoughts of one rejoicing? Such may be the joyous feelings and the thoughts of one rejoicing, like the dancing of the water on the waves when gently swelling. What do mournful thoughts resemble? What the long-tailed duck may ponder? Such may mournful thoughts resemble. Thus the long-tailed duck may ponder. As neath frozen snow embedded, water deep and well imprisoned. Often now my life is clouded, often is my childhood troubled, and my thoughts like withered herbage as I wander through the bushes, wandering on through grassy meadows, pushing through the tangled thickets, and my thoughts are pitch for blackness, and my heart than soot not brighter. Better fortune had befell me, and it would have been more happy, had I not been born and nurtured, and had never grown in stature, till I saw these days of sorrow, and this joyless time o'ertook me. Had I died in 6 nights only, or upon the 8th had perished, much I should not then have needed, but a shroud a span long only, and of earth a tiny corner. Little then had wept my mother, fewer tears had shed my father, and my brother not a tearlet.
This got dark. So Aino is lamenting, well, being born. And I think it's interesting how she talks about sort of how much less her mother and father and brother would have cried, because had she died after 6 days or 8 days being born, and I don't know this for sure, but I'm going to assume that 6 nights or 8 days, there might be some sort of significance, like, okay, the baby made it past 6 nights, that's a good sign, or 8 days, something like that. I could be totally wrong, but just because they mentioned it, I'm assuming there's some significance to it. And then the idea, children died quite often. They still die quite often. And it's not that uncommon. And it's obviously quite sad and tragic. But I think she's assuming that because she's older now, her parents or her family will be more upset because they know her and all that kind of stuff, which, it makes sense. But I get a little bit of a sense too, where she's saying it would be better off if she had not lived. It's kind of that bitterness that we see with Cain and Abel. Except with Cain, he's making sacrifices that he thinks are good, and they're not good enough. This is actually more something that's being put upon Aino, that she has no control over. There's nothing she could have done to change it. And actually, I mean, this thing that's being put upon her is literally the best thing that could be put upon her in the situation, except she doesn't want it. And so she laments her life, and you know, she's sad about her troubled childhood now that she has to, well, she has to move on. Part of this is definitely about growing up and having to participate in society. And, you know, the fact that Väinämöinen is so much older, I think really speaks to the idea that she would be joining in on a game that's been going on much longer than she's been alive. And that she has no real hope of changing the rules or even having a say in the rules. These are the rules, and she's going to be able to participate with them and follow them or not. And we see her struggling, and she's making it clear that she's refusing to, but you know, it's, I think we can all relate to that there are things that we have to do that we don't want to do, or things that happen that we don't agree with, but that's the way it's done. And things that we come up against that we just, you know, who doesn't have that dream of, like, you know, moving into the woods, living off grid, totally off, you know, the electrical system, the sewage system, and just being like, you know what, guys, I'm out, you know, and some people do that, right? You know, the whole off grid living is a thing. So this is a very real scenario and feeling that she's having.
Yeah, and you know, I'm no expert in the psychology of teenagers and things like that, but really it makes sense to me that a big part of the real the rate of depression, suicidal thoughts, and all that really comes up with teenagers is a part of not knowing how they're going to fit in the system that's around them. And of course, I think it's something like, they can't put that into words, you know, it's like, but the words that they use, something like, I don't know my life's purpose. I haven't found, like, what I'm going to do with myself. Like, there's a lot of pressure on kids, and in specifically those years, like high school. It's like, you got to plan your courses so you'll get into a university, and so that you'll get into like a program that's going to get you a good job, et cetera, et cetera. Then you got to get the house, the car, the 2 kids, all that, right? So it's 2 cars and 2.5 kids or something like that. That's the, you know, some kind of average, right? But no, the whole thing is just, I see this double whammy here of first of all, the pressure to fit into society while not necessarily feeling like that's going to work for Aino. And, you know, I think that's such a common thing, right? Not thinking that the system as it exists is something that you can fit into. Like, that's really the problem, right? You can want to change it as much as you want, but I think that's the reality, that change does not happen quickly. And especially big social structural changes do not happen quickly. And, you know, I'm sure that kids understand that on some level, that fitting into society as it exists is going to be tricky. It's going to be hard. You have to figure out how to do it. And that's tough. But then it's this double whammy here of for, in Aino's case, sort of being already put into this one box. So she's already got this kind of set out for her, but maybe she doesn't want to do that. And honestly, I can see the roots of feminism in general right here, because it's like, yeah, maybe a lot of girls and women don't want to live this way and don't want to go in this direction with their lives. The trouble with that at this time, you know, hundreds of years ago, was that they basically did not have a choice biologically. Like, essentially, as soon as they got paired up with someone, they would start to have kids and be responsible for their kids. And that's not, first of all, the responsibility for kids is not just a social, oh yeah, the woman, the mother has to go take care of her kids. Like, there are significant changes that happen when a woman gets pregnant, and that's all essentially the way I understand it is it's a whole lot of stuff to essentially make the woman want to care for her kids after they've been born, and to go through the absolute horror that is labor, which could result in her death or the death of the kid, or both, often both, if either, often both. And yeah, that's terrible. That's traumatic. And, you know, all this stuff, all these hormones, whatever, it's all to, the result is that if it goes as intended, we speak of design. I don't think we're implying design, but we're implying like that's just kind of the way the system has evolved. Yeah. But if the system is working as intended by evolution to get us here anyway, you know, it results in mothers having a significant bond with their children and wanting to care for them, right? And I mean, that's just kind of, I think that's just a biological fact that we have to come to terms with. And, you know, back in hundreds, thousands of years ago, this would have been an unavoidable thing. And really, you would get the men go out and provide and make the living however way somehow, right? And for the most part, the woman would take care of her children, her and her husband or mate's children. And I mean, that's all really more to say there wouldn't have really been an option a long time ago. There wouldn't really have been any other way of doing things. And I certainly can't speak to if there were outlier societies that handled things differently, but for the vast majority of societies and civilization, that's how it would have worked. But now, you know, of course, with the advent of birth control and a whole lot of other things, it doesn't have to work that way for a lot of girls and women, and hence feminism as a thing. I can see it here as far as how, well, in Aino's case anyway, she does not want to participate in this way and even feels suicidal at the thought of taking on that burden when she doesn't necessarily want to or feel like she can. And yeah, it's incredibly, I empathize with her extremely, because, you know, what kid doesn't grapple with the big, huge decision of like how you're going to fit into life, whether you're a guy, a girl, doesn't really matter. I think those are universals.
Absolutely. There's a lot there. Like, one, I think it's a little crazy that we expect teens to be able to plan out their lives. I mean, they can barely like get themselves to school, and then they're supposed to be able to pick the courses that will get them into the right university for the right course for the career they want. And yeah, no, it's nuts. And I know for myself, if I could, you know, go back and change things, like, because now I actually have an idea of who I am, whereas as a teenager, you're like, I think as a teenager, all you know is you want to do something, and then you look around and see like cool people on TV or heroes or whatever, and you're like, oh, I want to do something like that, and so you go that direction. But I mean, I know when I was a teen, the two biggest role models for guys were probably like Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. Like, that doesn't help. I mean, they were awesome, good times, but it's still like, well, that doesn't give you an idea of what to do with your life. And I think as a teenager, you look at them because they're so cool and always know what to say, and they beat up everyone, whatever. But again, it doesn't tell you who you are. It just tells you like, yeah, this was cool to my, hormone addled, 14, 15-year-old brain who can't figure out if he wants to fight everyone, or yeah. So that in itself is nuts. So I definitely feel for Aino here, because she's in that same situation where she's being expected to plan her whole life, and she's being given this like golden cage. And it's like, hey, this is going to be, because I mean, there are benefits to participating in society. There's a lot of cool gadgets and, safety. Generally, you can you eat, you've got shelter, all that kind of stuff. Like there are good things to it, but it's still a cage, right? So, and basically all of modern music is based on not wanting to be in a cage, or, I'm trying to remember if it was, I think it was James Dean, might have even been in Rebel Without a Cause, or was it Marlon Brando who had the famous line, like, well, what are you rebelling against? And the response is, what do you got? And like that, I think that sums up one, being a teenager, but also like we're seeing that here where it's, she doesn't really know what she wants, but she knows she doesn't want this.
Yeah, it's really that the path is laid out for her, and that takes away all freedom to choose anything other than that. And it could be a good life, and it could be a life that a lot of people will end up choosing. And that's sort of the thing too for women and girls and things like that. I mean, like, I cannot speak to the societal pressures or whatever, and not to be glib about that. I'm just saying all the societal pressures and all of the role models that are or are not out there and things like that. But I think it's a common desire to want to go do things other than make babies and be a housewife and things like that. And and then the kind of the funny thing is I think it is what a lot of women and girls end up choosing eventually, build a career and everything like that. But then it becomes very fulfilling for them to have kids and take care of them. And maybe they still work, and maybe that's also good. But, maybe that's also why a lot of women cut their careers short, or they take less time. They go for more part-time work, or they stop working for a very long time in order to spend more time with their kids. And that's a valid choice. And it's a choice that is made a lot. And, it's the catch-22 on that, where it's kind of like, yeah, you don't want to be shoehorned down that one path when you're 16 or something like that, but maybe you will end up kind of choosing that later in life. But that really is not to say that anyone's path, anyone at all, not just women and girls, is predetermined. I mean, for men, if the role model is like professional wrestlers and stuff, like, that's not what's going to happen. No. For most people, right? Or UFC stars these days or something like that. Like, that's not what's going to happen. That's not what's going to happen. But you see that as a role model, and then it becomes, you're going to compete, and you're going to be the best, and that's a lot of pressure there too. And going down that path is not predetermined. It's not predetermined. It's what a lot of people end up choosing. And whatever, for whether it's some kind of biological thing or people's preferences, whatever, it's all valid. It's all valid, but it's not clear. It's definitely not clear when you're a teenager why you're going to make the decisions you make 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, and they will make sense 10 and 20 years down the road, because your hormones are no longer completely raging out of control, and you can actually think and have some kind of sense of where your life is and where you'd like your life to be. And it's a lot different when you're in your late 20s, early 30s versus when you're in your teens.
Plus, your brain is just physically not developed in your teens. Like, it's not until you're about 25 when it kind of solidifies, like, okay, your brain, you're good to go, right? So, yeah. So you've got raging hormones, you've got like a half-baked brain, and, well, especially nowadays, like crazy media that, like, we thought The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin was awesome, and I'm not over exaggerating how big like those two were when I was in high school. Like, you'd walk down the hall, and at school, everyone was like saying catchphrases and, wearing shirts and stuff like that. Like, it was a big deal. And now it's even crazier, because like the internet was just like forming then, right? Now it's like, I don't even know how, a 15-year-old boy manages anything now, or a girl for that matter, but just, yeah, it's scary out there.
Yeah, and I think just to maybe recap this section, this is all just to say how it's completely understandable why Aino would not like the situation set out for her, especially because she's already got her path like set out for her already. And honestly, like as dark as it is, I can see how that turns into like depression and suicidal thoughts. And I mean, I suppose we should say something about if you're thinking stuff like this, go get help, because like you're not alone and all that. I'm not even trying to be glib or anything like that about this. Like this is serious material. This is probably the heaviest material we've actually dealt with here.
For sure.
And yeah. Like there are resources out there. We should probably in the descriptions and show notes remember to actually put one of those numbers or something down there.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea actually. No, that's a good idea, because no, this is kind of like the recipe for like depression and self-harm and all this kind of stuff. So
yeah, it's crazy serious, and it's not something to take lightly, and we're not taking it lightly. This is just how we are, but under the face of serious material, sometimes joking around with it can be the way of dealing with it. But yeah, and in this case, this is really, really serious. And this is all just to say I can see how Aino would get to this place, because yeah, like we're all teenagers once, right? Maybe you are in fact a teenager right now, and yeah, you're not alone. It's something that I think most people go through to some extent. Some people are lucky and can get through high school and life in general without having any ridiculous soul-crushing self-doubt. But I think a lot of people do, if not most.
I was going to say I haven't met one yet, but yeah. If anyone has never had like ridiculous, like soul-crushing doubt, let us know. Like I'd be interested to find out how you manage that. But
yeah, very. I definitely would agree. Have not met anyone like that. The next one after this section is one I want to like really dive into some of the societal concepts here. So shall we?
Sure, let's move on.
Okay. Lines 230 to 254. Back to the poem. Thus she wept a day, a second, and again her mother asked her, "Wherefore dost thou weep, poor maiden? Wherefore thus lament in sorrow?" "Therefore weep I, hapless maiden, therefore do I weep forever, that yourself have pledged me hapless, that your daughter you have promised, thus to be an old man's comfort, as a solace to the old man, to support his feeble footsteps and to wait upon him always. Better were it had you sent me deeply down beneath the billows, there to be the powan's sister and companion of the fishes. In the lake 'tis surely better there beneath the waves to sojourn, there to be the powan's sister and companion of the fishes, than to be an old man's comfort, to support his aged footsteps, so that I can mend his stockings and may be a staff to prop him."
So we have, I think, one of the clearest mythological symbols and symbolism in the whole Runo. Because when Aino is talking about the aged man, it's obviously Väinämöinen, but the symbol there is society itself. It's the aged father who, we're always talking about having to resurrect the father. Well, she's the one who's like keeping him alive until it can be resurrected and rejuvenated. And that does not sound like fun. And I mean, we see it now, I think, with a lot of the political stuff going on in the world, where, at least in the West, there does seem to be a real clash between those who are trying to resurrect the father, and then I would say Ainos who are like, I don't want to keep this old man alive. I want something new and better and different. And I think the nuance is that you can actually have it both ways, where if you rejuvenate the father, you do get something new out of it, right? Whereas in her case, she's kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But I definitely see why. Like, it's not as rash a decision as some might make it out to be. Like, there are legitimate reasons why, supporting the old man and sort of being his comfort in his old age is awful and terrible and just sucks.
Yeah, and the symbolic aspect of it is so powerful, right? Even on just the specific characters of it too. She doesn't see Väinämöinen the hero. She sees Väinämöinen the old man, and he's both at the same time, which is also very similar to Odin, right? In the Norse, the poetic out of there, because it's like he's at the same time he does all this heroic stuff, but he is this symbol of order and of the structure of civilization and everything. And so it's a really interesting combo there, that she only sees the old man. She doesn't see the hero who is at the top of the dominance hierarchy, and for good reason. And maybe this is a nuance that, well, we will definitely go back to this with Väinämöinen, but for Aino's perspective, having to do that, having to, like, yeah, it's so right on for her having to participate in this structure and prop it up, keep it alive, all that, right? Yeah, no, it's really something right there. And I want to get into a little bit of how this is the structure of monogamy and how that existed and has worked. And so, yeah, this is my particular thing for the day, my rabbit hole for the day, if you will. So my understanding of the way monogamy developed is that originally that was not the way the world was structured for a very long time. And the crux of it at the beginning was that essentially women were making the choice of who to mate with. And they were making a choice between, and not to put too fine a point on it, the men who could provide things like meat and other provisions, they would trade relations, sex, for meat or being cared for or what have you there. And that really is not to make it sound like, they're just selling themselves essentially as commodity sort of thing. But, at the end of the day, it reinforces, if it's that deep, the idea that men only want sex and are willing to trade away, vital things for living, such as food, in order to get the chance to reproduce, whereas women are only willing to go for the potential of reproduction if they're going to get something in return. It solidifies that sort of men are interested in sex and women are kind of inherently not, if from such a deep level that's kind of the way it works. And maybe just a little note here about essentially sex in general is something that for a man has very low consequences. It's a chance for the man to reproduce essentially. And then, they're done and they can go off and try again with however many women they manage to get with. Whereas for a woman, if she has sex with someone, well, that could result in a pregnancy. That could tie up her reproductive resources for 9 months. And then if the pregnancy is successful, which a lot of them weren't, and she's still alive because a lot of pregnancies resulted in the mother's death, well, then she would be tied up with a child for however many years until they can become independent, right? So the stakes are higher. The stakes are different. And so for the way it would have worked as far as a trade of resources essentially was that the woman would go with a man who could best provide for her, essentially provide for her needs, provide for the needs of the child. But a lot of women would pick, say, the best hunter in the group. And maybe he wouldn't get all of the women interested in, pairing up with him, but he would get a lot of them. And then, for example, only the men who were good hunters, as an example, would end up finding mates. And here's a statistic that I thought was like kind of crazy, was that at one time in the genome, it was something like only 1 in 17 men were reproducing, whereas virtually all women who got to puberty were reproducing, like virtually all of them, disregarding, cases of women dying in childbirth or whatever. But like all the men.
That's incredible.
Yeah, out of all the men, only 1 in 17 was reproducing at one time. Like that's such a huge bottleneck, right? And today, apparently, statistics are similar as far as the number of swipes that men have to make on Tinder before they get an equivalent number of responses from women.
That's nuts. So it's 1 in 17, and it corresponds with Tinder swipes.
Something like that.
Oh.
Yeah, it's
mind-blowing.
Well, yeah, right, because it shows how essentially broadly women are choosy, whereas men are just like, yeah, if you give me the opportunity, yes, please. So I mean, and the obligatory men are pigs and everything like that, but that's just to show how competitive it was between men, right? That is to illustrate both things. Men are competitive with one another to get even the chance at reproducing, and women are essentially able to take their pick of the lot at that point. But what that would result in is that only 1 in 17 men getting to reproduce. And that probably doesn't necessarily mean that only 1 in 17 men was married or whatever the equivalent was before monogamous marriage. But it certainly says something like only 1 in 17 men was successful in reproducing. So infertility could be a thing, or, premature death, whatever. But all of those things combined to a lot of men were not reproducing. A lot. The vast majority, possibly. And so from that perspective here, what are these men going to do? Well, so there were a couple of broad social solutions to the fact that there were so many men there who were not going to get a chance at reproducing. And one of them was going off to war. I don't know 100% about this, but I would figure a lot of wars, the cause of a lot of wars was just that you had an angry army of young men who needed to go out and either get killed or kill stuff. And then they would get the opportunity to reproduce with the women of the losing side. So
that's a very delicate way of putting the opportunity to...
Yeah. They were raping.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, that's not good for anyone. The only group of people that really is good for is the winners, essentially. And across time, I don't think there was any single tribe of people that was always a winner. You know what I mean? Not a single one. And so this is bad for the women on the losing side. It's bad for the men on the losing side because they would get killed. They want to take competition away, essentially. And it's bad for the men who have to go out and fight in these conflicts because a lot of them are going to die. The only ones who it's really good for are the women on the winning side, as long as they're still winning, and the men who are so successful that they don't have to go off to war. They're competent in some way. Like the blacksmith was not going off to war, for example. And the king was... he would probably go off to war, but not necessarily be like right there in the action sort of thing, right? He would protect himself. But so that's social solution number one. And that would not necessarily work so well. And I think if societies did not do that, they would actually get young men who are violently aggressive and would rape women. I think that is just the natural conclusion here. And we do not want that. We do not want that. Society today does not like rape. I have to emphasize that. Like, we do not advocate for that. We do not say this is a good thing. Certainly some aspects of certain people, certain groups try to defend men who are perpetrators and things like that. Like, oh, he's actually a good boy sort of thing. And I actually, like, I disagree with that wholeheartedly, because it's like, no, if you rape someone, you should get sent to prison for a very long time or worse, because that is a very, very, very bad thing to do. It's the cases where it's not provable, and unfortunately a lot of them aren't, where I do think you have to err on the side of caution. But when it's like, yeah, like you're found guilty of raping, it shouldn't be a slap on the wrist. That is like one of those things, and I can certainly see why there would be frustrations on seeing cases like that. But anyway, I've digressed a little bit. So one of the solutions here for this whole entire problem is monogamy. And this would have come up through mostly the Judeo-Christian societies, and that's kind of how it would have spread. But the benefit of monogamy to both sides, there's a benefit to both sides, is that, first of all, the men get much better success rate as far as reproduction goes. Still not exactly the same as women, who broadly can reproduce if they want to. And for men, there still get to be a lot who didn't get to reproduce, and that would have still been because war was still a thing, and because, you know, going out and being competent still needed to happen, and that would result in death sometimes. But it was still much more likely that a man would get to be paired up with a woman legally now. It's got the backing of society that only one man and one woman, essentially. So the benefit, first of all, is that more men get to reproduce. It goes from, again, that 1 in 17 to probably more like 1 in 2. And again, all the women are still reproducing. So this results in a vastly greater equality of reproductive outcome. And you could see that as a good thing or a bad thing, actually. Maybe if the men who are the most competent are the only ones who get to reproduce, maybe that was a huge, huge driver of human progress, advancement, evolution. Maybe that was a good thing. But at the same time, it also could have meant that, like, the next generation, maybe you get a kid who wasn't so good, but since he has all the wealth, therefore he gets to still be the one reproducing. So maybe that effect wasn't quite so there. And of course, it wouldn't have the diversity of different genetic groups and things like that. So yeah, that's really just to say there was a greater degree of economic success for more people. And that's why, kind of on an evolutionary perspective, that would have been seen as a good thing by the genes. Just to kind of, I say that abstractly, really, because on a level like not even subconscious, it would have meant that more people were getting to reproduce. Therefore, that behavior would have been encouraged. And then eventually that would have gotten codified in something like monogamy. And then the flip side for the women too is that the men they're with have to stay with them. So it can't be that you get this extremely successful man who goes between different women, and like infidelity is broadly frowned upon in society now, and that is a protection on both ends. So the men get more of a chance to reproduce, and the women get essentially a guaranteed provider. The downside is that women no longer get to choose the best possible mate. Or broadly, that their pool shrinks. As more men get taken out of the equation, their pool of potential mates shrink to less desirable ones. And the result is that behaviorally, it turns into that men get to go essentially get their pick, and as long as they find a woman who will take them, they're all good. But for women, if they don't like any of the mates that are available, you then have to, as a society, start shaming women who don't select a mate. That's the concept of like the old spinster who has been left on the shelf, and that might have been just a case of there was no mate that she felt desirable, and so you discourage that. You also discourage women from being promiscuous because, promiscuity could mean infidelity, and on the man's part, unfortunately, it tends to be somewhat unequal in terms of the burden here, in terms of who is given the responsibility. But the only way I can sort of see how this would have developed was something like the women are still the ones who are stuck with a baby outside of wedlock. And that means there isn't the broad societal protections of monogamy for them. And so you have to discourage promiscuity from the woman's perspective because she's the one who's going to end up ultimately getting the result there, the baby. And at the same time, I do think broadly under a system like monogamy, infidelity in general and adultery in general, to use terms that maybe are seen as outdated, but whatever, those are discouraged. It's discouraged to have sex before marriage because that could result in a pregnancy outside of marriage. And sex outside of marriage in general is discouraged. And that's what monogamy is. And for better or worse, it does put a lot of the burden and the oppression, the actual real oppression on women because they are denied the ability to choose the best mate possible. And then you add on other layers such as arranged marriages or families arranging the marriages now. And maybe that was a pragmatic thing for alliances or whatever. And you know, both partners essentially get the short end of the stick, but the guy is probably broadly fine with it in general because it's okay, I get a wife, that's nice. But the woman gets no pick in it, and the woman wants to be choosy. The woman wants to get the best possible provider and the best possible genetic material for her children to have the most potential. Men don't think like that. And I'm not saying this categorically like I know, but I'm saying like that's on a deep level where it's like, and no one is thinking like that consciously, but it's like, this is why. And so all that is to say, that's how monogamy would have developed as a way of providing more of an equal reproductive outcome for more people. And unfortunately, because I don't think there was a way to get to that arrangement. Otherwise, women end up losing the biological right to determine who their mate is on a broad sense. They would still consent to marriage and things like that, but it's more oppressive on the women in that case. And in the case of Aino and Väinämöinen, to bring it all back here, she gets zero pick at all and sees it as propping up this derelict institution that may need to be reinvigorated, which I would say is getting reinvigorated today with the advent of, first of all, sex is no longer completely going to result in a pregnancy. It's much less likely to, but also just the way society is going about it. I don't think we can go back to a way of organizing society as strict monogamy. We're not like in polygamy. We don't allow for that. We don't allow for polygamy, but we certainly, sex is much more available, and it's not as socially frowned upon to have sex before marriage. First of all, adultery is still frowned upon broadly, but then you get into things like polyamorous relationships, and where, you know, it's really only frowned upon if one side doesn't know what's going on or one side doesn't consent. As long as both partners consent, you know, open relationships, that's more of a thing now. And I'm not saying that's a solution, but I'm saying it's a way that at a minimum we're trying different things. And this approach that monogamy is, it resulted in stability for a very long time, and that's order. But it also resulted in a lot of oppression to specifically women. Wow, I was talking for a long time. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of like real world examples of things you're talking about. I know in China, they recently did away with the one child policy. And one of the reasons I suspect is that the number of men was far outpacing the number of women, because girl babies were more likely to be aborted, or like if you can only have one, they put a premium on male babies, so you're going to get rid of the girl babies. And that was actually sort of turning out just as you would describe what you thought would happen with not a lot of mates, is that you have a lot of very angry Chinese men who don't have an option for reproduction. So you were seeing the crime rate rise incredibly, and violent crime in particular. And then you were also seeing a lot of Chinese men leaving China to go find a wife, because there was literally no one to marry in China. So, and then with the war, like, you can really see it, I think, in the Eastern campaign in World War II between the Nazis and Russia. and it's kind of a weird time because we're modern, like the world was modernizing again, so that played a factor into it. But as as the Nazis marched into Russia, they basically left a trail of like rape and destruction. And then when they started losing the battle, Russia was like, okay, now it's our turn. Like the idea of winners and losers, like it did change quite a bit. And like no one really won that because everyone, like both societies were heavily impacted by that kind of, I guess, drive to reproduce. And I've mentioned this book before, but there's a book called Sperm Wars that talks a lot about the sort of the biological imperative of reproduction in men. And they theorize that, like in times of war, or at least in times of violence, their drive to reproduce goes up, and rape becomes a better option because they might die like in the next hour, in the next day, next week, that kind of thing. So that it's very heightened, and they're soldiers, so that they're physically powerful. They actually have the option of forcing someone to reproduce with them. And so like this is all very real, very, like it's been going on forever too. Like it's all very real and has many examples throughout history where this type of thing happens. I mean, even like the beginning of Rome, and I'm trying to remember what the town or the village name was, but the mythological beginning of Rome, they were building Rome, all these men. They didn't have any women, and so they went to, I was going to drive me crazy and I can't think of it, but it's very famous, and there are sculptures of it, and it's the rape of something. And they literally just went and got women. They just carried them off and brought them to Rome, and it was like, okay, you're here now, and now you're married. Like it's it's a very serious and real, and it's like biologically entrenched in us. So and I guess monogamy has been the way that we've kind of figured out how to mitigate a lot of these factors. But in that mitigation, there is a lot of like payoffs or trade-offs where it's like, okay, yeah, this part of it sucks, but we're not getting this, worse thing.
Yeah, broadly, the way it makes sense to me anyway is that yes, there is oppression for both women and men in that particular system, but there's a lot less rape and there's a lot less death. And the trade-off of stability seems to have been more valuable across those periods of time. Now, in the modern era, with such change, with so much change everywhere, in every aspect of life, I see it as natural that we would be rethinking that and trying to look at the social norm of monogamy critically and trying to figure out whether this is actually the best way forward for everyone. And the thing about it too is that in the way that pendulums swing, right? If we were to go back to essentially a state where monogamy is no longer a thing, I think the social implications would be drastic, and we're certainly in some kind of a middle ground where people who want to pursue monogamy can, but if you don't want to pursue monogamy, you don't have to. And I mean, I think you see women lamenting that their one night stand won't text them back, sort of thing. If there's no consequence for the man to go have sex, but he wants to do that, maybe that's just something that comes par for the course. And I don't mean to be necessarily callous about that. I mean, like, that is the effect, I think, of monogamy being de-emphasized, is that the outcomes aren't necessarily good for everyone, especially if there is that degree of freedom where men can largely have no consequences to a sexual encounter, and same with women as well. And of course, it's a good thing that women have less consequences to a sexual encounter, especially ones like pregnancy. If a woman does not want to have a pregnancy and birth control is available, like that's definitely leveling the playing field. And that's why all this change is happening effectively, right? And then you get the other side of it, though, where it's like, if a lot of men are not getting even the opportunity to reproduce, I mean, that is the broad basis of the incel movement, or just men in general who don't get an opportunity to reproduce at all. And I'm not saying they're justified in their views or anything like that. And I think the answer is actually they should have been socialized better. But sometimes you get a bad go of things. Sometimes you get guys and girls who are socially inept, and nothing is going to fix that. They might have the best parents in the world who tried their hardest and really, really gave it a good effort. But you have a child who cannot function socially. There's no way around that, unfortunately. But that's not what we're really seeing. It's not just people who essentially got a bad dice roll of the biological lottery or whatever. It really is. I think if we go away from monogamy too far, it will go back to something like that, lawlessness and a lot more violent crime, a lot more sexual crime, and we do not want that. Just to be clear, if that was not clear. So it's hard. It's tricky. It's kind of one of those balancing acts. And again, to bring it back a little bit, Aino does not want to participate in this structure. The alternative is hard. The alternative is at least nebulous. It's not clear exactly where society is going to end up by experimenting with not having monogamy as the overwhelming default anyway. Because I think that would be the case. We're not like monogamy is not encouraged above all else now. There's that flexibility and there's those options, and people who want to go be monogamous do, but there's also that flexibility for other things. And I'm not sure it's clear where society is going to end up. And maybe there is some kind of hybrid where a combo is going to work. But if it results in an increase in violent crime and an increase in sexual assault and rape, that's not a good outcome. And at a minimum, we would, as a society, want to mitigate that. But I don't know what the answer is there.
No, I don't know. I don't know what the answer would be either. But just too many moving parts. It's too complex. I mean, it's only been 60 years of birth control. Like we don't even know what that's. We don't know what the outcome of it is yet because it's still happening, right? So, yeah, no, it's all these things have to be navigated.
And we don't want to, as a society, go back to a state where half of the population feels oppressed. That's certainly not a solution, and it's hard to balance our biological tendencies, which I think result in that system where only 1 in 17 men gets to reproduce, and all the women get to reproduce. Going back to a system like that's not going to work either. So. Yeah, it's one of those things, and I think honestly it's an ongoing social issue. But back to link this up again, though, it is completely understandable that women might feel oppressed in this particular social system. Yeah, that was my broad point for that entire thing.
For sure. No, I'm there with you. Yeah.
Shall we move on?
Let's move on.
This will be lines 255 to 292. Back to the poem. Then she sought the mountain storehouse, and the inner room she entered, and the finest chest she opened, raised the painted lid with clangor, and she found 6 golden girdles, 7 blue robes of finest texture, and she robed her in the finest, and completed her adornment, set the gold upon her temples, on her hair the shining silver, on her brow the sky blue ribbons. On her head, the bands of scarlet. Then she wandered from the storehouse, and across the fields she wandered, past the marshes and the heathlands, through the shady, gloomy forests. Thus she sang, as on she hastened. Thus she spoke, as on she wandered. All my heart is filled with trouble. On my head a stone is loaded. But my trouble would not vex me, and the weight would less oppress me, if I perished, hapless maiden, ending thus my life of sorrow, in the burden of my trouble, in the sadness of my sorrow. Now my time perchance approaches, from this weary world to hasten, time to seek the world of Mana, time to Tuonela to hasten. For my father will not mourn me, nor my mother will lament me, nor my sister's cheeks be moistened, nor my brother's eyes be tearful, if I sank beneath the waters, sinking where the fish are sporting, to the depths beneath the billows, down amid the oozy blackness.
So we have Aino dressing up in the wares that her mother had, offered and suggested from the storehouse on the mountain, and then really considering, I guess, killing herself by, sinking beneath the waters and down amid the oozy blackness. And it's interesting to see that, her father will not mourn, her mother will not lament me, sister's cheeks won't be moistened, brother's eyes won't be tearful. Like, that's a very classic, suicidal thought, is that no one's going to miss me. So we're really seeing, I think, an accurate portrayal of depression spiraling down into suicidal thought, and not wanting to go through with having to give up the things in life that she doesn't want to give up.
Yeah, to me, it's almost like she goes through the effort of making an attempt to play by the game, but it just doesn't take. It doesn't work. She goes through and does what her mother says, as you mentioned, but yeah, she ends up here. The imagery she uses, Tuonela, that is the underworld. So this is specifically it here. She is like, I'm gonna go to the underworld, I'm gonna go to the afterlife, and that's just it. And yeah, it's hard to not be sympathetic with her here for being in this situation. Like really, this is powerful, and capturing this in such a poem like this, in this cultural monument, is significant. It's like they're not shying away from the dark things, and they're not shying away from really that understanding of human nature from different perspectives. Like this is telling a story. This is telling a story here that, well, I think if we were in some kind of a situation where only the stories of heroes and men and things like that were going on here, stuff like this would be ignored. This is powerful. This is a good story because I think so many people can relate to it, and I think honestly, I think a lot of girls can relate to it, and women. Like, I'm not one, but I would think you could probably relate to this, and that's a good thing. That's a significant thing. But she's in a dark place right now,
for sure. I wonder too if it's almost like a warning for women. Like, this is a story that you would tell like a young girl, sort of to get her prepared for the idea that, like, you're going to have these two options, and it's going to suck, and you can either sort of bite the bullet and agree to some oppression in order to get this, whereas the other option is kind of this, like, depression and going off into, well, really, I mean, going off into the great unknown. I mean, that's with, the underworld and, the oozy blackness of the water. I mean, that the symbolism of the water being the unconscious, and the the unknown, differentiated chaos. Like those are sort of the options, right?
Yeah, it's pretty clear here, and as we continue, it's gonna
get clearer.
Yep. Lines 293 to 314. Back to the poem. On she went, one day, a second, and at length, upon the third day, came she to a lake's broad margin, to the bank, o'ergrown with rushes, and she reached it in the night time, and she halted in the darkness. In the evening wept the maiden, through the darksome night lamented, on the rocks that fringed the margin, where a bay spread wide before her. At the earliest dawn of morning, as she gazed from off a headland, just beyond she saw 3 maidens bathing there amid the waters. Aino made the 4th among them, and the 5th a slender sapling. Then her shift she cast on willows and her dress upon the aspens, on the open ground her stockings, threw her shoes upon the boulders. On the sand her beads she scattered, and her rings upon the shingle.
So what we're seeing here is that she's kind of getting ready to go into the river, and the 3 maidens. It's interesting. I wonder if it's like a sign of, there are people. She's not alone in that. There are others who have chosen this path as well, or it could also be. Well, just like they're maidens who are free, right? Like I think she's seeing people who still have their freedom and might have more of a choice than she is going to. And then, she's casting off all of these things from her family that would make her, well, they're riches, right? They make her desirable to a suitor, to a man, and she's casting them off and sort of going into the water and embracing that path.
Yeah, and she sees examples of people who are doing it as well, and I think this actually reminded me of the movie couple years old, The Witch, with that goat Black Phillip, and spoiler alert, like the end is that the girl ends up joining a coven of witches and getting naked, and they do their magic and stuff like that out in the woods. I see that right here. It's like the symbol of the women who don't want to be in society, and I mean it's vilified in that particular story, and the idea of a witch and everything like that, like it's vilified. And I mean I think that's just one of the ways that girls are encouraged to stay within the dominance hierarchy and stay within the structure of society.
It's funny because I thought of that movie as well, and that particular scene. For the movie is great. It's a horror movie, so if you're not good with horror, you might want to steer clear because it's very well done. But this particular scene I remember watching it in the theater and seeing this scene, and I don't know how the director did it. I don't know what direction he gave the women who are dancing around the fire, but I remember watching it and immediately recognizing like the feminine in it, and I remember watching it and getting goosebumps, and I had this funny thought. I was like, the thought I actually had was like, oh, this is why men wanted to control women, because like what they were doing there was real power there. And I was like, oh, they're terrified because you couldn't. Watching it, I was like, as a man, I was like, wow, there's nothing I could compete. I don't have that access to that amount of power there to compete with it. It's an amazing scene. Like it just, I have no idea how they directed it to get that sort of ethereal, like, I want to call it like truth. There's something real there. And so I remember watching it and just be like, wow, like no wonder, no wonder there are men who are scared of women and, want to control them, because what they have there isn't, it's hard to describe even if you see it. It's like the power they were displaying was uncontrollable in its nature by design. And not only were the women who were dancing around the fire okay with that, but they were also able to roll with it. And for men and the masculine, which is about ordering and sort of getting rid of chaos and stuff like that, you see that and it's just like, oh, I can't do anything with that. And so I wonder if it's kind of like she's going there, and I'm just thinking of this now. She's going there because she knows that Väinämöinen can't follow there, because it's just not. He's a man. He's masculine. He's got the male energy, and he will never be able to understand that.
Exactly. The entire. Well, first of all, that whole scene, but just the entire concept of women who embrace the chaos and embrace femininity, that goes against the structure of monogamy. For sure it does, because it's like embracing that and going outside of the system, and then them being the ones, I think, by extension, they would do their picking from outside the society sort of thing, right? It doesn't work with that order, and for social order to continue, that would have been discouraged. And this image, it's like Aino is going into that sort of situation where she is she is going to embrace chaos, the feminine. She's going to embrace all the things that really symbolize that freedom that she doesn't have access to under the system that her parents have set up for her and society in general.
For sure. And that's not to say that we say this all the time, that the chaos isn't necessarily bad. It's undifferentiated. Anything can happen. And I think that's sort of the scary part, and embracing that anything can happen, which I think actually is a pretty feminine thing, because I think if you're able to give birth and create new life inside you, you're kind of in tune with that. I mean, it just sort of comes with the territory. And but with men, that there isn't sort of that natural connection with it. We're much more build walls, put everything in its nice compartment. And so seeing that and recognizing that we can't do that with it is what do you do with that, right? You try and, I guess history has shown us, you try and stop that type of thing, sort of nip it in the bud, so that you don't ever get to that point. You're able to rein it in a lot sooner than that.
Yeah, and then obviously the result is that over time, that gets oppressed, that gets suppressed, that gets oppressed, and then now we're dealing with the latent the latent consequences of going about that for hundreds or even thousands of years, right?
For sure. I think too, a big part of that you can see is in Western civilization, there's no concept of a goddess, right? There's in Catholicism, there's Mary, but she's definitely not on par with, God the Father. And she definitely has a special spot, but it's certainly not the spot of the goddess that you would have seen in pre-Christian Europe or other parts of the world, in Hinduism and things, areas where there's still, I guess, the indigenous religions. They do have a goddess, and there does seem to be a better integration of that, undifferentiated, chaotic element of the feminine, that it's woven more into the society, and a lot of these things you don't see. So
yeah, I think the symbol is the Great Mother, almost more specifically, and I mean the common examples of that, for example, from Hinduism is Kali, and an image of her is she is devouring men while simultaneously giving birth, and it's that is integrated. That integrates chaos, destruction, creation, all of it gets integrated, whereas that was suppressed under the structure of monogamy, where the view and what was valorized of the female, the feminine, was specifically only the mother, only the mother who is creative. That was the only side that was embraced, and there was nothing of the other darker sides of chaos that can result in destruction, but also creation in much more chaotic ways. I don't have a better word for it. So, well, I probably do, but my brain is starting to, yeah.
It reminds me. I just thought of this. There was back in the days of the British Empire. There was a saying that really, I think, captures this. It was that the hen that rocks the cradle rules the empire. And it's the idea that the mother who is raising the citizens of the empire has that power. And it doesn't really, well, it kind of gets around the lack of goddess in society, but it still doesn't put her on the same pedestal. Like, there's still that, and I'm loath to use this word, but there's still that patriarchal. And when we say that, I think we mean that in a very like precise, limited sense. Where, yeah, I'm sure we could talk forever about like the patriarchy, and I'll use air quotes in sort of the like mass media kind of way. But the way we're talking about is sort of a very specific idea that I mean, I don't think you can argue that there is sort of a patriarchal philosophy and mindset at the core of Western civilization.
I agree, and you know, perhaps a part of it that we might be sort of learning from this story might be that they do not embrace the feminine properly, and actually in future Kalevala stories we're going to see like a proper great mother type symbol there. So that's not missing from the Finnic stories here, the Finnic mythology. So, shall we move on?
Let's move on.
Lines 315 to 370. Back to the poem. In the waves, a rock was standing, brightly hued and golden shining, and she swam and sought to reach it as a refuge in her trouble. When at length she stood upon it, and would rest upon the summit, on the stone of many colors, on the rock so smooth and shining. In the waves it sank beneath her, sinking to the very bottom. With the rock, the maiden Aino sank beneath the water's surface. There the dove forever vanished. Thus the luckless maiden perished. She herself exclaimed in dying when she felt that she was sinking. To the lake I went to bathe me, and to swim upon its surface. But like tender dove I vanished, like a bird by death o'ertaken. Never may my dearest father, never while his life endureth, cast his net amid the waters, in these waves so wide extending. To the shore I went to wash me, to the lake I went to bathe me. But like tender dove I vanished, like a bird by death o'ertaken. Never may my dearest mother, never while her life endureth, fetch the water for her baking from the wide bay near her dwelling. To the shore I went to wash me, to the lake I went to bathe me. But like tender dove I vanished, like a bird by death o'ertaken. Never may my dearest brother, never while his life endureth, water here his prancing courser, here upon the broad lake's margin. To the shore I went to wash me, to the lake I went to bathe me. But like tender dove I vanished, like a bird by death o'ertaken. Never may my dearest sister, never while her life endureth, hither stay to wash her eyebrows on the bridge so near her dwelling. In the lake the very water is as blood that leaves my veinlets. Every fish that swims this water is as flesh from off my body. All the bushes on the margin are as ribs of me unhappy, and the grass upon the margin as my soiled and tangled tresses.
So we have Aino then walking into the lake and getting on a rock, and I think it's interesting how they describe the rock, because it's a stone of many colors, so smooth and shining. Like it is a place of beauty and reverence. Like it's not just any rock; it's a special rock. And then she sinks beneath the waves and drowns herself. And then says that, my family will never use this water again, for the various things that they do, which I think is very true. I think families tend to, if they lose a family member, they will often kind of avoid going that way. Like I know I've definitely heard of people who, if they lost a sibling in a car crash or something, they won't drive on that road past that spot anymore, that kind of thing. It's a very natural human thing to want to avoid places of great tragedy. And I think it's interesting that she talks about, she's going to be, she's basically becoming one with the lake, and her body is sort of merging with it. Because I think it really shows that she is embracing that unconscious, that undifferentiated chaos that water represents, and that turning away from society would represent. If she were to go with society, there would still be undifferentiated chaos, but there'd be all these sort of structures and institutions around her to protect her and mitigate the damage that the chaos could do. But she's rejecting that completely and going so far in the other direction that she's sort of becoming one with it, and embracing that whatever happens, it's just going to be her and life. Like,
yeah, I see exactly where you're going with that. And to me, on a symbolic level, the idea that her family can no longer go that direction, then I think it's sort of saying like, okay, you have made your choice. I'm making mine. I'm going and embracing chaos, but now you can't, because you are a part of this rigid, strict structure. You can no longer get the benefits of embracing chaos yourself. You can't get the benefits of embracing the unknown in that particular way. And of course, more on the like the tragic side of it. Of course, that makes sense too. But on a symbolic level, that's where I go with it. And yeah, she I think tragically has gotten what she wanted, which is to go back and become undifferentiated again. And I mean, I think that could be sort of what happens, when someone dies, is like, their potential is gone. It's like it's sunk beneath the waters. They no longer have the potential to act and interact with the world and to make any sort of a difference that way. You're just part of the water. And if she got what she wanted in terms of embracing chaos and having that freedom, now she can no longer go out from that lake, if we're kind of being literal here, right?
Absolutely. And it's interesting, this type of story, the reluctant bride, we talked about it a little bit earlier in Skirness Mall. So with Gerda and Skirnir, and she's not quite willing to get married to Frey, but there does seem to be this type of motif, and we've talked a little bit about how there are some stories for men and some stories for women, and I definitely think this is a type of story for women. And I know that if you watch or read The Power of Myth with Joseph Campbell, it's on Netflix right now. It's 6 episodes. Highly recommend it. I think I've watched it twice and then went and bought the book to follow along, because it's that good. But he talks about this type of story, the reluctant bride, and he tells an Iroquois myth, which I think it's fascinating because we've been talking about European stories, but they found it like in an Iroquois mythos as well, which is, across the Atlantic Ocean and, very different. So I would imagine the story is very, very old, and it involves a young woman who, rejects all of her suitors, much to her mother's chagrin, and like people in her hunters in her tribe that are like really good hunters who, she rejects all of them, even though all of them would make fine husbands. And then, one day in the middle of the afternoon, the sky goes black, and, this impossibly handsome, strong, beautiful man comes by and asks for her hand in marriage. And she, of course, says yes. And it, of course, turns out that he's like a deity. And so she goes back to his encampment, and, her husband says, okay, I'm going out with my brothers to go hunting. So she's like, okay, I'll stay around the village and do things that women would do. So like repairing the teepees and preparing meals, that kind of thing. And so as she leaves the tent, she sees all of these giant snakes, and she goes back in the tent. I'm paraphrasing here. There's more to it than this, but basically it turns out that her husband and the brothers and all the men in the tribe turn into snakes, and she kind of tries to deal with it, but then realizes like, no, it's too scary. And she runs off into the woods, and the snakes are slithering after her. And to escape them, she sees like a medicine man in the woods near a lake, and he's on the other side of the lake. And to escape them, she has to jump into the lake and completely submerge herself, and thus escaping from this. And the message that Joseph Campbell gets from it is that if you're going to participate in this game or not, you have to be prepared for the outcome one way or the other. And that either way, like if you're not prepared for it, and in the story of the Iroquois case, she was being too picky, right? And so she had set herself up for being with a deity, which a human can't interact with. It's too there's too much of a difference between, imperfect humans and perfect deities, sort of that level, right? So, but she had to return to the undifferentiated chaos and to the subconscious, and sort of like go back to sleep in order to be able to go back home and kind of start over. And I don't think it's for no reason that we have kind of a similar ending here, where she jumps into the lake to go back into the chaos and kind of not start over, but start something new.
Yeah, the almost like reset herself or something like that. No, it's great. And when we point out these connections, it's really not to say like, oh, it's so amazing that these different cultures have that connection, but it is. but it's also to say like there's something to this, right? This is an idea that goes deeper than just whatever this one culture came up with. It's something like this is an idea in multiple cultures, right? And from that, maybe we were actually getting to some core here.
Exactly. If many people who are not connected through geography or migration have come up with similar stories, like maybe there is something, it's like coming to the same conclusion from different angles. It's like, okay, maybe there is something here. And or that the story is like far older than we can imagine because of various migration patterns and things like that. But still, if they were still using the stories, there was still value there. There was still an application. And I think that's the real goal, right? Like when you find something that can apply to people, sort of no matter culture, no matter time, there's something there.
That's what we're digging into and what we're really trying to find. And it's great to know that this story has parallels like that, because that just adds weight to it. It's definitely one of those things that we really like to see all the time, and that's why we bring those connections in. So yeah, so and to circle on back here, Aino has died and returned to the chaos. Shall we see where this goes?
I think so.
Lines 371 to 434. Back to the poem. Thus the youthful maiden perished, and the dove so lovely vanished. Who shall now carry the tidings and repeat the mournful story? At the dwelling of the maiden, at the homestead of the fair one. First the bear would take the tidings and repeat the mournful story, but the bear conveyed no tidings, for he strayed among the cattle. Who shall now the tidings carry and repeat the mournful story? At the dwelling of the maiden, at the homestead of the fair one. Then the wolf would take the message and repeat the mournful story, but the wolf conveyed no tidings, for among the sheep he wandered. Who shall now the tidings carry and repeat the mournful story? At the dwelling of the maiden, at the homestead of the fair one. Then the fox would take the message and repeat the mournful story, but the fox conveyed no tidings, for among the geese he wandered. Who shall now the tidings carry and repeat the mournful story? At the dwelling of the maiden, at the homestead of the fair one. 'Twas the hare who took the tidings and conveyed the mournful story, for the hare replied discreetly, I will not forget the message. Then the hare sprang quickly onward, sped the long-ear with his story. On his crooked legs he hastened, with his cross-like mouth he hurried, to the dwelling of the maiden, to the homestead of the fair one. Thus he hastened to the bathhouse, and he crouched upon the threshold. Full of maidens is the bathhouse, in their hands the bath whisks holding. Scamp, come here, and shall we boil you? Or, O broad-eye, shall we roast you, either for the master's supper, or perchance the mistress' breakfast, for the luncheon of the daughter, or perchance the son to dine on? Thereupon the hare responded, and the round eye answered boldly, Would that Lempo might come hither for the cooking in the kettle. I am come to give you tidings and to bring a message to you. Vanished from you is the fair one. Perished has the tin-adorned one, sunken with her silver buckle, drowning with her belt of copper, diving in the muddy water, to the depths below the billows, there to be the Powan's sister and companion of the fishes.
This is an interesting part of the Runo, and I haven't sort of figured out a comprehensive way to interpret it, but I find it very interesting that we have a series of animals who are predators who are supposed to take the story and tell the family and obviously like the sort of the village what's happened, but they all get caught up in, well, like hunting, and they get caught up by their prey, right? It's like they get distracted and then go off and do their thing. And it's not until we get to the hare, who is a prey animal, who goes and is able to tell them. And then even when he gets there, like we see them talking about, cooking and eating him. So even there, he's prey in it. And I wonder if that's sort of a nod to the idea that, these other animals aren't really oppressed. They're more the oppressors. And it would take another person or another creature who's oppressed to be able to share this mournful story and to do it justice. Like the other animals don't really care, because it doesn't really, they don't connect with it. But the hare seems to take great care in making sure that he gets to the place he needs to get to and does the thing he said he would do.
Yeah, and The thing here, a couple of details that the hair brought up. First of all, just to kind of get them out of the way, the bathhouse is the sauna, which is like the primary cultural contribution of Finland to the world is the sauna, essentially, and they use it even currently, like all the time. And the bath whisks they're talking about are like these birch branches that you actually beat yourself with, which exfoliates your skin and is like very healthy for you. But anyway, the whole thing here. So I think he's being in that situation is sort of, first of all, very personal, but also very kind of community oriented. And the hair is bringing this tiding to these maidens there, where they are kind of in this vulnerable spot and doing something that would be good for them. I think this all says something like, this is a story that gets passed down for the benefit of these maidens. This is something you need to know about, but it's going to be like passed down by, I think, something like other women, right? Would tell this story, and that's how you know. The other reference to Lempo here, that was an old god of love and fertility, but became more like a devil under the auspices of Christianity. I think he's just swearing at them is really what this kind of seems to be here. He's just swearing at them, like telling them off for suggesting to roast him because he's bringing an important message. But I think the whole thing is something like, if they go roast the hair, they won't get the message. Like they have to be willing to listen and see how valuable of a message to hear what this story was. And maybe at this point it sort of becomes like, here is the alternative to going going to refuse to go play the society's game of monogamy and all that, whatever, is to, essentially to go die and put yourself back into chaos. And this is almost self-referential in that it's saying this is a story that should be told. That's sort of what I get out of this.
Definitely. And I think too that the normal thing would be, if they saw hair, would be to eat it, right? And that's sort of the social norm, because it's good food. And it's almost like they have to step away from the social norm to even hear the message of this is how you, like, this is what happens if you decide to fully submerge yourself in the chaos outside of the social norms. It's like they have to take you're saying it's self-referential. It's very much that. It's taking that step outside and looking at the situation and trying to look at it from the outside, so you're admitting basically that a lot of it is like constructed, right? The social norms are constructed, and then you're able to make the sort of an educated decision on whether or not you go with it or go the other way, as Aino did. But to be able to do that, you actually have to take a step outside and be able to look at it.
Yeah, it seems like it's sort of a cautionary tale for women and girls, at least up to this point. It's a cautionary tale. Not only but we've been immersed in Aino's emotions and her feelings to this whole situation. So I think it's something different from just sort of saying like, you have to toe the line or else. Like it also shows the despair at the situation and some empathy and sympathy to it. So it's complicated. It definitely, I don't think it's making kind of an intentional critique. It's just sort of saying this is the way it is, but we collectively get that it's hard, and that really, really you can go to a dark place if you don't want to embrace it and play with it, and we don't want you to go into that dark place. I that's the best that I can come up with as far as how this story would have developed and how the story would have been passed on. I don't think it's saying like you have to be oppressed and toe the line or else. It's like society does not want its maidens, its young girls to go in this direction, to have this fate be to have this be their fate.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. I think it's I almost think it's like a sober look at the situation. It's like you've got this side, and here are the benefits and the drawbacks, and then you've got this side, and like now you see it. Now you get to make the choice, but at least now you know what's going on.
It will take one last turn though as we finish this off. So shall we?
Let's do it.
This will be lines 435 till the end. Back to the poem. Then her mother fell to weeping, and her bitter tears flowed freely, and she loud lamented, speaking in her grief the words which follow. Never, O unhappy mothers, never while your life endureth, never may you urge your daughters or attempt to force your children to a marriage that repels them. Like myself, O wretched mother, urging vainly thus my daughter, thus my little dove I fostered. Thus the mother wept, lamenting, and her bitter tears flowed freely from her blue eyes in her sadness, or her cheeks so pale with sorrow. After one tear flowed another, and her bitter tears flowed freely from her cheeks so pale with sorrow, to her breast so sadly heaving. After one tear flowed another, and her bitter tears flowed freely from her breast so sadly heaving on the borders of her garments. After one tear flowed another, and her bitter tears flowed freely from the borders of her garments down upon her scarlet stockings. After one tear flowed another, and her bitter tears flowed freely down from off her scarlet stockings to her shoes, all gold embroidered. After one tear flowed another, and her bitter tears flowed freely from her shoes, all gold embroidered, on the ground where she was standing. As they flowed, the ground they moistened, and they swelled to streams of water. On the ground the streams were flowing and became the source of rivers. Thence arose 3 mighty rivers from the tears of bitter weeping, which were ever ceaseless flowing from the weeping mother's eyelids. From each stream that thus was fashioned rushed 3 waterfalls in fury, and amid each cataract's flowing 3 great rocks arose together, and on every rocky summit there arose a golden mountain, and on every mountain summit up there sprang 3 beauteous birch trees. In the crown of every birch tree, golden cuckoos 3 were perching. All at once they called together, and the first cried, "Sweetheart, sweetheart," and the second, "Lover, lover," and the third cried, "Gladness, gladness." He who cried out, "Sweetheart, sweetheart," sang his song for 3 months running, for the young and loveless maiden resting now beneath the water. He who cried out, "Lover, lover," sang his song for 6 months running, sang to the unhappy suitor who must sorrow through his lifetime. He who cried out, "Gladness, gladness," sang his song for all a lifetime, sang to the unhappy mother who must daily weep forever. And the mother spoke as follows, as she listened to the cuckoo. Never may a hapless mother listen to the cuckoo crying. When I hear the cuckoo calling, heavy beats my heart within me. From my eyes the tears are falling, o'er my cheeks are waters rolling, and the drops like peas are swelling. Then the largest, broad beans larger. By an ell my life is shortened, by a span length I am older, and my strength has wholly failed me since I heard the cuckoo calling.
Well, that's a cheery way to end this, right?
That is not a happy ending.
No. And so we see that the mother has seen the mistake of forcing her daughter to be married to someone that she didn't want to be married to, and ultimately, I think forcing her daughter into playing the game in a way that she might not have been ready for or willing to play. And then we have sort of this incredible scene of her tears, creating mighty rivers and mountains and beauteous birch trees upon it, I think there are a few ways to interpret this. I kind of get this idea that that's how these things are made through grief, and if you've ever lost someone, which most people have, I think, you can kind of like build a psychic landscape out of that grief, and it can become a mountain. It can become sort of a permanent fixture in your life, and you kind of you don't really necessarily get over it. You just sort of get used to it, and you continue on living. But it's always there, and there's always reminders of it, which I think the cuckoos are the reminder that, you know, she's got this terrible grief inside of her that she is in part responsible for, and that, you know, it's never going to go away, and it's always going to be there, sort of nagging at her.
Yeah, I think it acknowledges Aino's mother's part in this whole situation, which was to force Aino into a situation that she did not want to be in. And you know, I think the ultimate message there, first of all, there's two parts to it. One is definitely something like Aino's parents should have prepared her better for the realities of the life that they wanted her to lead eventually. And of course, the whole thing with Joukahainen and Väinämöinen, that was all a surprise to them. Him promising his sister, Joukahainen promising his sister to Väinämöinen. Like, I mean, that's a surprise, right? But the whole thing there is like, I think they could have done more to prepare her for the reality, which is certainly one side of it. But then the other is also a case of like, yeah, maybe the exact way that we go about this is resulting in many girls and women feeling despair over their social situation and not having that freedom, not being able to embrace what naturally they want to be able to embrace. And again, I don't, this isn't me, this isn't my experience, I don't know this, but it makes sense to me that would be where a lot of women and girls would go with seeing what society has laid out before them and not wanting to necessarily toe that line. Yeah, it's hard and it's despairing, and the imagery here is just amazing because it's like the depths of grief. They say that it's essentially endless, and I think this poem is going to extreme lengths to show the depth of grief and to understand the depth of grief. Like, I'm sure that this poem, I'm like virtually certain, would have been originally composed by mothers who lost daughters, something like that. At least that section, right? You don't get imagery like that without understanding it. And the whole thing is just, this is a tragic story. And I think it's something like a warning. It's something like a critique of the social order, but not so heavy-handed as all that. It's not saying like tear it all down, but it is saying like that it fails some women and girls. It fails them, and it acknowledges that. And maybe there is something about like doing more to better prepare the maidens for what happens by the example of this story. But it is a beautiful poem.
It really is. It's a beautiful poem. It's a tragic poem. Saying that I really liked it, it makes it sounds weird, but I think there's real truth here. I think it gets to the core of some real human struggles and experiences. So I guess like beautiful in that way, you know? And, no, and like you feel sad for Aino. Like this, she was really up against it, and you know, she chose a way to get out of it. And yeah, it kind of sucks for everyone.
It does, and I mean, I want to emphasize that part. It's like this is she thought that her parents, her family would not grieve for her, but then her mother grieves for her endlessly. Like That's not the answer. It's not the answer to get out of the society's expectations. And certainly I think this definitely says something about how society can do more to better help the outliers who don't necessarily see the value of participating in it. And yeah, it shows the immense tragedy that every individual life lost actually is, and for it being a product of the rigidity of society that some girls specifically here are left with dealing with. It definitely says there is more to be done to ensure that this doesn't happen. And of course, I don't think there's ever going to be anything that's perfect, but it definitely says that there is work to be done as a society to better support the lost.
For sure. It makes me wonder too if Joukahainen will get some sort of comeuppance for, trading his sister away like this. And I'm not sure how to feel about Väinämöinen. He's a virtuous man, so that there's nothing there that is questionable, but surely he could have imagined how someone might not want to marry him, right? Especially without even knowing about anything until it's, marriage time. So
no, he does nothing here. He does nothing that he wasn't supposed to here, and he, for all intents and purposes, is playing by the rules.
Exactly.
Which almost speaks to maybe the obliviousness of men sometimes for the perceived pressures and things like that are there. Like, I would definitely say that I do not want any woman who encounters me to feel like I am putting any undue pressure on them or anything like that, but it's perceived, right? And that's something that I have heard over and over from just by listening to women in general. It's like that societal pressure is perceived by them, and you know what? Yeah, I think this story says you gotta listen to that.
For sure, right? They're not all wrong.
No.
Yeah, no, it's a pretty intense and in-depth poem and story. There's a lot going on in it, and it really digs deep into, I guess, the female experience, and I think it does show the weakness of society with the outliers, right? Väinämöinen didn't do anything socially wrong, and yet this was the outcome. And I think that there's a huge lesson to be learned in that.
Huge. No, this was a major heavy poem. And yeah, again, as you said, saying you liked it sounds a bit weird, but no, I really like this. This made me think, and it was honestly almost challenging in a lot of ways for me. So I don't have anything more to say about it though, and I think we've recapped it fairly well here. So I'm good with that being that, if you are.
I think so.
Okay, just to wrap up here, as usual, you can get a hold of us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. On Facebook and Twitter, we are at Northern Myths. On Instagram and YouTube, we are Northern Myths Podcast. Always appreciate comments, and we love chatting with people about this stuff. Always appreciate a share or a subscribe. Those are both great. If you know people who might enjoy this, or know any groups or anything like that might appreciate this show, we love getting a share, and tell us about it. We love to hear about new people we're kind of getting connected with. And to subscribe on YouTube is always appreciated, or on your podcast platform of choice. Definitely helps us grow and expand. iTunes reviews or reviews on any other platform are also really appreciated. Again, they just help us grow and reach more people, and that's always appreciated from our perspective. And we do have now a couple of ways you can support the show if you like. We have a merchandise store if you want to purchase any shirts or anything like that. We've got shirts and mugs right now on there. It's on Teespring. We'll include the link at the bottom there. A little bit from every sale goes back to the show. And then we also have a list of recommended books and a page of recommended music as well on our website that we've talked about or referenced here on the show. And it's just a bunch of books that have either influenced us or that we are actually covering on the show. And they're all Amazon links, Amazon affiliate links. And so if you purchase any of the books on there through our link, or anything else on Amazon, then a little bit will go towards the show for that. And it's a way to support the show if you were going to buy those books anyway. So check that out. And other than that, I do want to mention again that we are changing back to, for a little bit here, we're going to go back to one episode every 2 weeks, just so that you're not left wondering why there's not a new episode next week when you check on the Saturday there. So it'll be back to every 2 weeks, just so we can focus on the quality a bit more. We're just, a lot going on in our lives personally, and we don't want to keep up with a schedule of one episode a week if that's going to mean sacrificing the quality of the program. And we think now is the right time to take a short break to get back into the schedule of things here. And so it may not be a permanent change, but definitely it's going to be for the short future here. So.
Yeah, funnily enough, life doesn't really care that we're doing this. So it has its own things that it wants to do with us. So we've got to take care of that, keep the roof over our heads and food in our bellies, that kind of thing.
That's exactly right. But we do have 29 episodes now at the conclusion of this. So, if you haven't listened to our back catalog, that's always available there. And we've definitely reached a point where, suddenly we've got almost 30 episodes, and it's like, oh yeah, you could actually go binge watch that or binge listen if you wanted to. So that's an option there to fill the void while we're going back to one episode every 2 weeks. And you know what, if you're interested in other podcasts, some others who we've gotten in touch with who are, good friends of the show, there's History of Vikings with Noah Tetzner. That's always a good one. And he's got a lot of great interviews with some great people. There's the Fjorn's Hall podcast with Fjorn the Skald. He's a great storyteller and goes into some more obscure stories from Norse mythology. So that's definitely a good one. There is the Viking Age podcast, definitely a big one in terms of just telling stories about Viking history and mythology and things like that. And the Saga Thing podcast as well, which goes into the sagas and kind of ranks them as well, which is pretty cool. So those are all great options. There appears to not be any other Kalevala themed podcasts out there. I think there's some episodes here and there from certain either mythology themed podcasts or whatnot, but they cover it like kind of in one episode. And as you can tell, we've spent almost 3 hours just on this one, and a couple of our other Kalevala episodes have been really long too. So I think you can tell what we think about that as far as the need to give the Kalevala a significant amount of time. But anyway, if we ever hear of any others, we'll certainly recommend them. But
something worth checking out too would be like Jackson Crawford's YouTube channel. He's the professor who translated the Poetic Edda that we use, and we've got a great interview with him, but also on his channel he takes a deep dive into the language and to some of the stories, and it's a great resource, and he's an interesting guy. So definitely, if you need more of a fix, definitely check that out.
We'll include links to all of the aforementioned podcasts and Jackson Crawford's YouTube channel in the podcast notes and the YouTube description here. So, Am I forgetting anything, Dan?
No, I think that's everything except for one last thing, and it's for all of us to go out and find the myth that we're living. And for this one case, if the myth you're living is the Fate of Aino, we will also have resources below for, if you're feeling down, you can talk to someone and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that definitely needed to be said there. Okay, this has been the Northern Myths Podcast. Thanks for listening.